Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Schools Climate Summit, which is part of London Climate Action Week. I'm delighted to welcome you. My name is Malini Mhera, and I'm a co-chair of the London Climate Action Week Education Group. We are going to talk about communities in this session. We've had a couple of fantastic sessions earlier today on the 4Cs and the 1F. We've had campus and curriculum, and we actually ended the curriculum session talking all about communities. So it seems that there's a real nice segue directly into this theme, which looks at the role that schools have as anchors in their local communities and how communities come together, collaborate on climate action and sustainability issues. So it's my pleasure to start with one of our host schools for the summit, with the City of London Academy, Coyle. And I'm delighted to see you, Tess. You're going to speak on behalf of the school and why the summit is important to you. Thank you. Over to you.
Hi, Melanie. Thank you for that introduction. I'm Tess at Coyle now, so apologies if any of the bells goes off if you are in school. So at Coyle, our purpose, the exploration of life, guides the education of our students through this transformative period of their lives. They are immersed in the best that all has yet to come before, to enable them to shape what will come next for themselves, but also in the wider world. Whilst we have the highest expectations of our students, academically, we know they want to thrive in the wider world, and our students are required to develop a set of skills and emotional intelligence that cannot be easily measured. So through the exploration of life is delivered in line with our values and through our 4 curriculum areas. Our values dictate how we act in the pursuit of our purpose, and our academy has a core value of integritas and 3 additional values of ambition, resilience, and duty. We're really aiming to try and be a more sustainable school, and we believe that sustainable schools are very important to give students an educational program, a physical place, an organizational culture to encourage the development of environmentally conscious global citizens. Students spend the majority of the day in the school building, especially like one of ours in London, we're in Bermondsey, during their most crucial development years. In this time of pivotal growth, schools must be a space for creative thinking, a source of inspiration, and a starting point for developing a sense of awareness and responsibility. The journey to that goal begins with educating students in a healthy and sustainable environment. Through this, and to push and help and support our students to do this, before the pandemic, pre the lockdown, we had a regular climate club, which had a huge impact of reducing litter, using pickers around the school. We stopped using single plastic bottles. We stopped serving them in the canteen. They were not possible to buy at school at all. Instead, we issued out every student with a reusable plastic bottle that they were able to fill up at several water fountains around the school. We established a meat-free Monday, vegan Monday, every Monday in the canteen, serving delicious meals without using meat. And we made sure to explain to students why this was and how this was climate appropriate. We issued recycling bins in every single classroom. We sat down with the canteen staff and helped send students to them to learn about what happens to the food waste. We started working with the local Gallywell primary school to help work with them and help teach the youngest generation the importance of how they can help and what they can do as well, and why it's important to be more climate conscious. We're also going to be working with them in the future on the allotments that we share outside of the school, and trying to sort of plant some fruit and veg and things like this. In our next step, we're going to be reviewing all of what we've done before, and we are moving the Climate Club as itself to a green society in line with other societies that we're establishing in the school. We'll set up a question and answer in the staff room for teachers' input. We're also holding our first climate cup trip in line with actually Sussex Green Living and their Youth Eco Forum as well, who wanted to get involved with taking young children to the countryside and to get more in touch with nature, to understand the value and importance of protecting our climate. We are also working towards, in our green society, trying to get our numbers up to the club, up to at least 17. We'll be chairing a president and a vice president, and we're trying to include students across all year groups so we can work towards getting our eco school certification. And the climate summit really matters to us because we really want students, and the students really want to get involved as young people because they are becoming more climate conscious, and it's something at Coyle that we really want to push. Young people have a distinctly unique state in the fight against climate change, and they're becoming more and more aware of this now. Sorry, I didn't think that would happen. Our decisions and actions over the next few years will shape the world we live in for the rest of our lives, not to mention that of the children and the young people. And it's such a monumental challenge, but one we cannot afford to shy away from. Young people around the world, and not just our students at Coyle, are standing up to politicians and polluters and taking the future into their own hands. In our communities, our school, our countries and abroad, we have the tools to take action and stop the climate crisis. We're using them. So the youth will be the leaders of tomorrow, and we're trying to help them lead for today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tess. Thank you for sharing your sustainability initiatives and your ambition with us, and for reminding us of the challenges facing schools right now. I know that you've got exams going on this week, so we're really very grateful for you for joining us, and hopefully next time we have the summit, you'll be hosting us physically. So thanks so much.
That'd be great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm off to go and invigilate an exam. Very boring.
Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good luck. Take care. And it's a pleasure now to hand over directly to Darren Coyle, who's going to be the chair for this session on communities. And Darren comes to us from the British Council, a key partner in the Climate Summit. And over to you, Darren. Thank you.
Thanks, Malini. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, everyone involved with the event today and everything that's going on. It's vitally important and really a great pleasure to be a part of it, representing the British Council today. We've got another great session, a panel this time on community. So what we're going to spend the next sort of while doing is really look at the vital role of schools as community anchors, and look at how they can leverage the various relationships and links that they have within their local communities. First of all, however, before we get to our panel of speakers and move into some questions and answers, we're just going to have a headline address, first of all, from Nick Gardner. Nick is the head of climate action at the National Lottery Community Fund, and Nick is just going to talk to us for about 10 minutes with his talk. And I know that Nick's got some great questions as well to pose to you as our audience, following on from his talk as well. So Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Darren. That's great. Yeah, very pleased to be speaking to you today. I do have a few slides to share as well, so I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully that will work. Do let me know if you can see that. I hope so. We can share it now on a big screen. Can you see the slides there, Darren?
Looks good to me. Yep.
Okay.
Good to go, Nick.
So yeah, I like to open and close a talk with a bit of a cartoon, just because it helps to lighten the mood. It's pretty serious issue, obviously, climate change, but this is a really good graphic where you've probably seen this one before, of illustrating really the fact that we have a number of key issues facing the community more widely, but also young people in particular today. And climate change, as we know, is a very, very important topic, if not the most important topic for us to focus on, and in particular for young people coming through as the next generation, as we've so greatly heard there from a summary from Tess. We did a survey at the National Lottery Community Fund last year and found that climate change was one of the top 3 concerns for young people as it stands. And it's absolutely critical to engage young people and not just on the topic of climate change, and not just leave it to the politicians or to the adults to deal with. And so in terms of schools needing, schools clearly need to focus on climate change and the education role that they play in the more formal role there. There are, for example, plans for development of a GCSE in natural history, which is exciting to see coming through. But this session is really going to focus on the role of schools in their community and how they can act as wider ambassadors and wider educators. And we have a real focus in the Community Fund about young people and the importance of youth voice. So I thought it was appropriate to start with just one of the programs that we support and think about that question of why we should focus on education and schools, in particular when we're supporting young people to take action in their communities. The I Will campaign focuses on young people up to the age of 20 to take action in their communities. And through programs like I Will for Nature, we've supported projects like the Transform Our World website, which is available to everyone and has a bunch of key resources. You've probably already heard about that one, but I'm sure we can share some links in the chat after this. And a fantastic project in the Derbyshire county by the Woodland Trust to convert a former coal mine to a 400-acre young people's forest, working with children and teenagers to plant 250,000 trees over the coming years. This campaign found that in 2017, the proportion of young people who participated in taking social action was estimated at 39%. And I think despite the growth in investment and attention given to this topic, in particular youth social action, in connection with the campaign, the number hasn't changed significantly since 2014. And actually schools probably play a key role in starting to shift that dial, and I'll explain why. We found that there are a number of reasons to believe that schools and the education system more widely may be pivotal in increasing participation rates in youth social action and vital to close the socioeconomic participation gap. Firstly, we asked the question in the National Youth Social Action Survey to young people who hadn't been involved in social action in the last 12 months. The question was, what would encourage you to take part in social action? And the first most popular answer was, if I could do it with my friends. But the second answer very clearly was, if I could do it at school or college or university. So clearly there's a big demand there. Secondly, an estimated 59% of young people who participated in social action in 2017 actually got involved through their school or college. And so it's a very important role, it plays a very important role in triggering that. And school itself is a more important driver for participation for young people in lower socioeconomic classes and categories. A recent paper by Eddie Hogg at the University of Kent makes the case that the schools are the most egalitarian way to introduce young people of all backgrounds to youth social action, because the socioeconomic gap is smallest where participation in schools is at its highest. And nonetheless, there is a significant socioeconomic gap in teachers' perceptions of their school's social action culture. So only 27% of primary school teachers in schools where a high percentage of young people were eligible for free school meals were saying that social action was deeply embedded in their school, compared with 57% of primary teachers in schools where there was a low rate of free school meals. I just wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about some campaigns that I've been involved with personally and have enjoyed taking part in, and see if we could pull out some lessons for schools in particular and their role within the wider community. Outdoor Classroom Day is a brilliant example of a campaign which was started actually right here in London by a wonderful teacher called Anna Porch, who started up this idea called Empty Classroom Day. She wanted all of her schools in Croydon to commit to taking at least one class outside on the day, and to share ideas and practice and resources around what they could do on that day. That campaign, by the time I got involved, was already shared across the country and had taken, I think 600 schools had taken part in the first few years. And we teamed up. I think one of the sort of questions about this key topic is how businesses can get involved. We teamed up with Unilever to help promote the campaign as a much wider global campaign. And this really shows what the power of a good idea can do. From that little nugget of an idea that Anna had back in 2013, I believe it was, we've seen that campaign grow and grow. And you can see the spread across the world of schools participating just down there in the bottom right in the map. But to date, in the last 5 years, we've seen over 10 million kids taking part in action and taking part in Outdoor Classroom Day through their schools over the years. And it's really clear for us that this campaign was all about taking children outdoors and encouraging them to spend more time outdoors, because spending time outdoors has a critical positive impact on children's lives. Playing, learning, exploring outdoors has been shown to improve physical and mental health, to improve academic development, and indeed engagement with the climate crisis, and ultimately happiness of children as well. I had a think about what we've learned from the campaign, in particular relevance to schools and engaging communities. And I think one of the main ones is the wider involvement of community in campaigns such as this. We were very focused in the early days on how many schools we had signing up, how many children were signing up, and the kinds of activities they could do, providing resources for them, etc. But digging a little deeper in the surveys that we had run over the last few years, we found that over 10,000 people from outside the school environment, parents, etc., had taken part in Outdoor Classroom Day, typically volunteering to help the teachers get outdoors, but maybe providing some talks, maybe providing some resources and ideas and campaigns. So direct involvement in campaigns such as this, which are school-based. Another great way that these campaigns can be useful is as a leverage point for talking to local media. And so we've seen some great examples. One local school near me here in Surrey went to the BBC Radio Surrey and Sussex breakfast show on Outdoor Classroom Day last year and was able to talk about the wider issues of climate change and the reasons why it's very important to spend more time engaging with nature. And the third point, I think, is really that it's a campaign such as this is very focused on one day, but the wider movement is much more than that one day. So indeed, we've seen more than a third of schools that have taken part have told us that they've built outdoor learning and outdoor play much more into their daily school life beyond simply just the Outdoor Classroom Day, which I think is a great testament to the fact it's a great. Building on that campaign, and another schools led one is Backyard Nature. This was all about encouraging children to become backyard nature guardians and looking to pledge to protect nature where they live. It's about getting to know, getting to love, and ultimately caring for the environment around them. What we're aiming to do is to build the next generation of environmentalists. And of course, the idea originated within a school. This is the picture of the Eco Emeralds in Anfield in Liverpool. They had worked out that they wanted to find different ways to make their school more sustainable, and very quickly found that the schools was providing various food items which had palm oil in. And so they wrote a letter to the managing director of Iceland Foods, Richard Walker, and also in the picture, and complained about the ice cream that they had and the fact that it contained palm oil. And that kicked off a much wider campaign called Backyard Nature. And I think the power of such a campaign is to really leverage the public interest in these kind of issues. And so Prince William featured this campaign, this schools-based campaign, in an ITV documentary in October last year called A Planet for Us All. Now, I just listed a few thoughts here really about looking forward. What role can schools play in their local community? How can we build on the position of the school as a hub of the community, and how can we build on its position as reaching out to a huge number of active age population? It is a cliche, but schools are really preparing the next generation for their life. And actually, the issue of climate change is all about intergenerational equity. Young people provide us with the next generation of our community, but indeed they're very much a part of our community, which we mustn't forget. And so it's very important for young people to have a clear voice within decisions that are made. And how can schools ensure that this voice is heard? One way that I've seen is through helping to coordinate letters to MPs, and also for schools to participate in programs and schemes such as My School, My Planet, which is run by Learning Through Landscapes and funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It's also clear that schools can provide a focal point for parent campaigns. As the nature of a school, schools are very much about putting on school events, providing the chat around the school gate, etc. Parents are very engaged, clearly. But how can we leverage that sort of role as an anchor institution for communities? In my daughter's school, a couple of parents have floated an idea very recently, really, to bulk buy washing up detergent, soaps, and other cleaning products, and then have a weekly collection point where people would bring in their own plastic bottles to refill at the school gates. The school can also play a role in triggering wider discussions at a community level. For example, a programme we're running with WWF to help promote the wider take-up of the David Attenborough film, A Life on Our Planet, is planning to work with a number of schools in local inner city areas to help a wider proportion of the community to see the film and then to take action around it. There's a point around the use of the school council and the parent-teacher associations. I remember when I was growing up, for example, all of our school costumes for the plays were homemade, very much so these days. I believe there's a much greater take-up because of fast fashion and throwaway items, that many more children are using one-off costumes which they buy online. And what role could the PTAs, for example, play to help coordinate a better recycling, reuse of those costumes? And lastly, a focal point for community campaigns. I've got a couple of examples here from the Climate Action Fund. This great campaign on the left-hand side is in Chorlton. It's a campaign where the local community is rethinking what transport could look like and should look like. And in May, just last month, they ran a successful school streets trial where they took over the street and kept it open for children to play, etc. And that's just one example of how the wider community got engaged in a discussion around what the streets should be for. And on the right-hand side, we have an example from the Ormiston Academies Trust, which have been doing an amazing amount of youth social action projects, all of which have a great impact on their communities. And just to finish up with a few questions for the audience to ponder, really on the theme of community. First question is, how can the school use its assets? And here we're not just talking about buildings and outdoor space, we're also talking about the people, the teachers and the position in the community to raise awareness of important issues like climate change. Second question I pose would be, what role could the school play in educating the wider community on important topics such as climate change? And the third question would be, what kind of training is appropriate for key decision makers in the school? So here we're talking about school heads, teachers, governors, parent-teacher associations. We have, is it appropriate, is it possible for schools to organise some carbon literacy training, for example? Could you involve knowledgeable people in the wider community? I know that there is a network of several thousand climate reality leaders across the UK who are trained to give free talks. Could we bring some of them into schools, etc.? As I said, I was going to close with a cartoon as well. Here is one of my favorites. It's a few years old now, but really it talks to the importance of co-benefits of climate change. And I think we're probably beyond the point now where we're discussing whether or not climate change is a real thing, but I still love the point here, which is that there are so many wider benefits that can come from taking action on climate. And just a last quote from Margaret Mead there, which is one of my favourites, and an image from the Our Bright Future programme, which is all about upskilling young people to take part in the green economy as they grow up. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. Really interesting way to kick off our session. You know, some of the key messages that struck a chord with me in there, really around how, I think while we're all here actually for the session, you know, how schools and their role within the communities can act as that kind of, you know, wider advocate and almost ambassadors for climate sustainability, the pivotal role they play around social inaction, and the way they can get young people involved, both from school and then out into the wider community. And again, you know, in some of your questions there, which I hope our audience today will consider and feedback in the Q&A, maybe with some further questions and comments for our panelists. How can we leverage the assets, the people, the connections, the capabilities around us in our schools and in our communities to really galvanise those efforts that we talked about in our wider community? So thank you so much for kicking us off. I'm now going to introduce our panelists for the session. We're going to run until about 2:45 with input from each of our speakers, and then try and allow 15 minutes for questions and comments. So in terms of housekeeping, please do use the Q&A and the chat function, which we'll be keeping an eye on. please do keep yourselves on mute if you're not talking, just to try and minimize the disruption, especially with the heavens having opened, at least where I am in North London. And you know, really please do try and participate as much as possible in the Q&A session, because we do have some great speakers with some great insights and experiences that building upon what Nick has contributed already will make for a really lively and interesting session. So thank you so much, Nick. Great way to kick us off. So in no particular order, but that appears on my list, I'm going to start with George. But George, just to tee you up there, can I just say a few words on behalf of the British Council, as is the chair's privilege. So I'm representing the British Council today. If you haven't heard of us, we are the UK's cultural relations organisation, creating connections between the United Kingdom and countries around the world through shared global challenges such as climate change, but also in the areas of the arts, education, science, and the English language. What's the British Council's role in terms of the agenda today? Well, in terms of the area of schools work, where I'm based, leading some of our major schools programs, we have an exciting array of opportunities to support teaching and learning on climate change through programs such as the Connecting Classrooms initiative. You can read more about that in the brochure that's been provided for the summit today. And specifically, you know, we've got ready to go downloadable classroom resources on sustainability, opportunities for schools to work together with schools in other countries on climate projects. We've got competitions for schools and for pupils to showcase their learning and action on climate change, and professional development opportunities for teachers. So I'll stop the plug there for the British Council and our work in climate change, and also just finally point you towards a session that our colleague Anne Roots is running at 4 o'clock on global school partnerships and how our programs, you know, support schools exploring the SDGs and taking action on climate change. So just want to get that in before we get into the topic. So we're going to start with George as our first speaker, George Marshall. George has at least 30 years of experience working in all areas of particularly communications and advocacy around climate and sustainability. Previously worked at Greenpeace and Rainforest Foundation, advised governments, businesses and international agencies. You may have come across some of his documentaries and writing in a variety of places. So I feel really, really lucky that we've got George with us today. In his current role, he's the founder and spends a lot of his time working with climate outreach. So without further ado, George, can I give you 10 minutes to speak to our audience today? And look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Darren. And I've got the timer going, so I'm going to really try and keep within time. Thank you so much. Yeah, I want to recognise my colleagues in climate outreach. We're specialists in climate change communication, so please do look at our website. There's 25 of us, and we have a very strong interest in education generally, but also school level education. We've just completed a large project for how to build climate change awareness in Alberta, in Canada, which is really the kind of like the heart of the work we like, which is going into very difficult contested spaces and trying to build climate change awareness. As you might know, Alberta is a very oil dependent province in Canada. I guess the starting point, so let's kind of like, this might lead further into the conversation, is to start talking about awareness of climate change as a right. Not as a little piece of information which comes through on the educational curriculum, but a right, that people have a right to be informed about this in order to make informed decisions, that children have a right to leave school understanding enough about climate change to make those decisions. I mean, that's a moral right. I think we need to look at that in the same way as we do, you mentioned the term carbon literacy, but in the same way as we do literacy or numeracy. This is essential for people to make sense of the world that they're entering. So it's not a peripheral, it needs to be central to education. What most people don't recognize is it is actually a legal right as well. So in the original Framework Convention in 1992, in the Paris Agreement, which I'm sure that you've all heard of, There are dedicated articles, Article 6, Article 10, by which signatory governments commit themselves to educating people, their citizens, and their children about climate change. And they have failed to do that. I mean, the school level education is better probably than public education, but it's still weak. And it's still talked about as if it's a little part of their learning rather than actually a fundamental commitment to learning. So on that basis, let's see schools as being not just for their students, but within their communities, the point at which we meet that commitment in order to engage. And engage is an important word. It's not just talking at people, it's a conversation, a two-way conversation where we talk to people and we listen back. And like all good education, it's a two-way process. We've done a lot of work in climate outreach on attitudes across society. There's a large piece of research on our website called Britain Talks Climate, where we look at everybody across society, recognizing that to move forward, it's not just about engaging and mobilizing the concern. It is fundamentally important that we reach and energize people across society, that we reach across and we build a mandate for action. Because as soon as we start implementing the policy, it's all very easy for the government to say, yes, we'll go for these ambitious targets. But as soon as we start implementing the policies to reach those targets, some people are not going to like it because they're going to affect their way of life. There may be costs involved. And it is essential that people understand what it's for, but also that they support that action. And I'm always worried that climate change generally, the environmental movement, but also that climate change education does not reach well beyond certain demographics and certain constituencies. Within Britain Talks Climate, we identified large parts of society who feel alienated from the climate change discussion. The level of concern is consistent across society, by the way. Everyone is concerned, but the level of actual awareness and understanding and a degree to which the current communication speaks to people's values and concerns is very different for different groups, especially for people who are less well educated in their own lives. We're talking here about adults who may be lower socioeconomic groups, who might be more conservative in their politics. And this is a real challenge for us. So I get a little nervous about, with all respect to what you were saying, Nick, about projects which talk about, things we do for the planet, or that are green and that are presented in that way as being environmental education or environmental projects. I'd really like to see climate change start by saying, what are your concerns and how can action on climate change, like in your last slide, how can that meet those concerns and then build from there backwards? I think it's very easy for people to push aside the environmental thing if they don't feel that's part of their values or the values of their parents or their background. All that being said, if we're talking about building a mandate, there's a clear opportunity for educational institutions, for schools and the whole infrastructure of education to reach right across society. So the goal should be everybody passing through education has a right to be informed, and that is fundamental. We need to have some sense of what defines that right, just as we would with say with literacy or numeracy. Like, what are the benchmarks by which we measure whether people understand, whether they're leaving school understanding it sufficiently, and also this sense of building this broad-based mandate. And not surprisingly, when we say what role can schools play in their communities, or what is the thing that we should be doing, from our point of view in climate outreach, the key thing is we have to get people talking about it. We have to enable and empower people to talk with their friends, with their families, within the wider community about climate change. There's a very good body of research, and we are primarily a research organization, that shows that there's a socially constructed silence around climate change, that people express in opinion polls that they're concerned, but in reality, most people don't really have a meaningful conversation about climate change from one year to the next. And again, that is very much more in certain groups in society. So how can schools, sorry, it's not a question rather than an answer, how can schools energize and initiate that conversation? And I would suggest the starting point for that is enabling the conversation between students within schools. So not having a sort of like didactic approach which says, here, we're going to explain to you what greenhouse gases are, but much more of a social studies approach of saying, right, let's talk about this. How do we feel about it? Recognizing and respecting that many teenagers, and we've done a lot of work, especially with teenage groups, are deeply concerned and worried about it. So there's an anxiety there which needs to be witnessed and respected and brought out into the open, allowing them the space to talk through these concerns. We have to be very careful with apocalyptic messaging, because that can build on people's concerns and they can go into a kind of defensive retreat. So we need to talk carefully about this. And giving them a sense of power, and power not just, as I said, about their own emissions, because in truth, most young people have very little power over those things. Power over the conversations they have, because that's where they have the power to mobilize their peers, but also to reach back into their families and communities and start that conversation. It's obvious that part of that is addressing the school's emissions themselves, and hopefully I see other people here will talk about that and the schools and school energy use. But I'd like to also address this issue of the emissions that are involved as part of learning outside the schools. And there's kind of two areas particularly I'd like to look at with that. Well, there's one actually within schools which might not get mentioned, which is about food waste, which I think is really important and where schools can play a strong example. Food waste often underestimated or under modeled in terms of its climate change impacts, and it's huge. I mean, food waste is a massive part of emissions. But the ones I'd like to focus on are how people get to school is so important, not just in terms of the impacts of doing it, but in terms of the life patterns that it establishes. I mean, I'm a lifelong cyclist. Because I cycled to school, I really encouraged my own children to make their own way to school, but I despaired at the number of children who are now being brought in and shuttled into school, creating a car dependency and a lack of understanding of anything wider. And that's definitely something to look at. And related to that is the issue of air pollution levels around the school from a school drop. We need to break climate change out of this environmental box and speak wider. And one of the key ways we can speak wider is around health, and especially air quality. And this is very pertinent to many people. It's a way that we can try and make things relevant to people. And clearly one way that we can do this is in terms of the air quality issues directly around schools. And I did a whole lot of work on public attitudes to air quality. And we know that this is an issue which reaches deep into areas which normally messages about climate change can't reach. But it's about harming the innocents. It's about hurting the people who are vulnerable. And we really need to do that. So school policy on that. At every point, whenever a school does something, it needs to engage society and the community and say, this is why we're doing it. This is why it's important. This is our school policy. Not just take it for granted, people understand, but explain carefully. So health should be there. And as I'm keeping an eye, I'm going to do this bang on time for you. The final thing which I'd like to flag up is school trips. Because in the last generation, we have now become used to the idea that schools make long distance jet hauls to foreign destinations as part of school trips. And that's not just for elite schools, as we know, that schools right down my very small local comprehensive was doing long distance flights as part of it. And it is normalizing long distance trips as a part of accepted learning. I'm very concerned about this. I think this does not set a good model. So I'd like to discourage that. Okay, I'll stop with that. Thank you.
George, thank you. I think we could have listened to you for a lot longer, actually. That was really powerful, and it woke me up to certain things as well. That even just taking my own kids on the short walk to school, around the corner here, the things that we should all be considering as parents, as members of communities, as people in positions of responsibility in our organisations, etc. So thank you very much. Because of time, I'm going to move us on, but there are a lot of key messages that I took away from that I'd like to come back to a little bit later on. So thanks very much. In terms of our next speaker, then we're going to move now to Lucy Harbour. Lucy, I can see on screen there. Hi. Lucy, just to introduce her, is co-founder of Cleaner Air Sooner. So picking up on some of the points that George was making in the latter part of his talk just now. Lucy's the director and founder of Coyle World Consulting, delivering environmental engagement campaigns for local authority schools, bus drivers and hospitals, and no doubt countless others working in and around communities. So hugely relevant to our topic on this panel. So Lucy, without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Darren. And just to say, apologies, but unbeknown to me, my husband had arranged for a tree surgeon to be at our house today. So there's quite a noisy chainsaw in the background. If you can't hear me, could someone indicate, and I will see if I can find another place to sit. Thanks for having me along to talk today. Some really fascinating, interesting talks and points made so far. So I'm Lucy Harbour, I'm founder of environmental consultancy Coyle Consulting. And today I wanted to talk about a couple of schools and a couple of projects that are having, I think, a really profound impact on their local communities. Really inspiring, and I quite like to share what they're doing. So I'm going to be speaking with my professional experience, working with schools, through my consultancy, but also as a parent, I've been working with my children's local school and the local community to try and raise awareness and encourage people to take action on climate change and also air quality. So in my professional work, I've been working with schools and hospitals for around sort of 7 years or so on climate change and cleaner air projects. Got expertise in carbon footprinting, as well as also working on clean air projects. And our focus of our work is very much on taking direct action and trying to really bring about change. So a few years ago, we ran the Idling Action campaign, just an example of a previous project, which worked on with Green Gumption, who I think are here today, and also Nick's former organisation, Project Dirt. So we worked with the Mayor of London and local authorities in London to try and encourage drivers to stop idling, and that involved working with lots of schools, doing lots of workshops and assemblies to try and raise awareness and get kids to pester their parents to stop idling. And then more recently, we've launched a programme called Cleaner Air Sooner, which is funded by the Clean Air Fund, and we're providing toolkits to schools. We've got a sort of handful of projects that schools can undertake themselves to try and take action on air pollution. From a personal perspective, I'm also a parent of 2 children who went to a very polluted school in London previously. And one of my children has respiratory problems. So I spent several years working on projects with pupils at that school and within our local community. So first I thought I'd just mention, I've been recently, just sort of in the last 2 weeks, suddenly back in schools and working with pupils again, which has been so great after the COVID restrictions. It's been so lovely to hear from the pupils again after we can finally stop talking about COVID. And one thing really struck a chord with me the other day. It was a secondary school pupil at a meeting, and he said, "We did the school strikes and now we want to take action." And I think Greta and Extinction Rebellion, they've done such an amazing job, and all the other organisations that are working to raise awareness as well. And I think there's now a real thirst for action amongst young people. And I think it's just the most wonderful time to try and seize on that and try and empower people to take action. And I think as the speakers were discussing in the opening address, I think there's a real need to focus on agency now. So there's been so much work on raising awareness. We now need to just sort of empower people to use their energy and their passion to now take action. That comment came up by that pupil. That was at a meeting of a group called the Green United. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about first. It's a project's been set up in a town called Lewes in East Sussex, which I've recently become aware of and now got involved in. And the aim of the project is to bring young people together from, there's 5 or 6 different primary schools in the town, 2 secondaries, and then support the young people to take environmental action themselves. It's very much focused on empowering and enabling the young people to do it. And the focus is also on local issues. So we know there's been lots of work by David Attenborough looking globally about the issue, but the focus of this project is what are your local issues and your local challenges, and what can you do? How can you take action? So far they've come together and sort of got about 5 projects, which are all fantastic. There's one project these are all proposed by the pupils themselves, not being pushed into it by the parents, I don't think. So one is about citizen science. They want to do air quality monitoring and try and have a school street at one school. That's because they have a very narrow street with lots of traffic coming down it, and lots of people's being exposed to pollution. And there's also ones about improving cycle routes in the town for young people. Very, very tricky town to cycle in. And schools are coming together to look at solutions. And since the projects have been proposed, the Green United organisers are then asking local organisations, individuals to come together and try and offer their time or their talent or their skills, or they call it treasure, basically funding, financial donations to help the pupils take on some of these projects. And it really has inspired the local community. It's been great. There's been local councillors getting involved. Individuals have been making, individual contributions, the local universities supporting their work, organisations and campaign groups offering their expertise. And at the individual school level, I just don't think this level of community involvement would have happened. So I think there's a real lesson to be learned here about schools coming together. This has happened in Sussex, but it could happen anywhere in London. Perhaps it is. Schools coming together as a local community and working together to try and bring about change. And the pupils are also learning democracy skills, which I think is brilliant. There's a few pupils, representatives from each school that are now on an environmental youth board. And, pupils just aged 10 and 11 are now making decisions about budget, about strategy, how to spend money. It's really empowering for all the pupils involved. And they're really beginning to work together like a system, as this summit is all about. So, what I think is great about this is how it's just inspired everyone to get involved. And it just shows, what you can do when you all join up. But then there is, of course, lots you can do at the school level too. So I thought I'd talk briefly about my children's old primary school, William Patton, which is a school that's been working really hard with the pupils and the parents to try and create sustainable behaviours and inspire the local community. It's done lots of wonderful projects. The school is on a very polluted main road. And in fact, I had a GLA school audit that said part of the primary school playground should get closed because it was so polluted, which is quite a distressing piece of news for the parents to hear, as well as the teachers that are meant to be keeping their pupils safe. In particular, if you've got children with respiratory issues, you don't really want them exposed to high levels of pollution. So at our school, we had very much a parent-led campaign. Fundraising for a green screen that could be put up, which is basically like green bushes and plants that could try and block out some pollution that was coming across from the main road, since it wasn't possible to get rid of the traffic from the main road, which would obviously have been our preference. We did a mapping project where everyone getting together and helping. I did a lesson for pupils on air pollution and how it affects child health. Pupils went out and did pollution monitoring, looking at different routes to school, which are the more polluted routes, which are the less polluted routes, how can we breathe cleaner air on our way to school. Pupils then did some drawings that they could use in a map, which was then created with the help of other parents that were sort of illustrators and graphic designers. So a big sort of team effort from the whole community to try and get together a sort of cleaner air route map that would show the pupils, these are the polluted roads to avoid, these are the nicer sort of cleaner air roads that we could choose. And while that project was done, specifically with one school, we were aware, and I'm aware through my professional work as well, that we quite often find there are certain schools, and I think someone mentioned this before, there are certain schools that do engage in this kind of project, clean air projects, environmental projects, they do one after the other. They're very, very engaged on this topic. There are other schools that don't, and it's not necessarily that the children aren't interested in it or that the staff aren't or the parents are. They often are, but they just don't have that parent, driving force or that one member of staff that happens to be really passionate about the topic that's driving it through. And quite often they have many, many other problems that they're trying to prioritise at their school, and clean air just isn't up the agenda, or sustainability. So how can we sort of work as a community to try and help other schools in our community to benefit from some of these clean air projects? So one option, is the Green United model. Another thing we did with William Patten was to make sure that everything we did was shared with the other schools in the area. So for just a few £100 more, when we were printing maps for every family at the school, we also printed them for every nursery school and every primary school in the area, so they could all have a copy of the map. And then we had some banners printed for the school gates, and we shared them all around the schools, so each school could have it up on their gate for a few months. So the more schools can think beyond their school gates and think about the local area, the wider the impact we can have. And then I'm not sure what I'm doing on time, apologies, but then after the sort of high profile projects that we did at William Patten, we found lots of schools were then asking us, what can we do? How can we sort of replicate what you've done? Or, how did you find out about green screens? So that was one of the sort of what inspired us to then create the Cleaner Air Sooner programme, which is funded by the Clean Air Fund, and we have toolkits for 6 achievable projects that schools can undertake themselves. So if you want to do something but you don't know where to start, which schools often don't do because they can't see pollution, they don't know where it is, they don't know how polluted they are, then these are really simple projects that an eco team or a sort of class could take on themselves. And in this programme, we've got things like anti-idling toolkits for training up pupils or eco teams to be sort of anti-idling officers and go out and tell parents to stop idling. We've got a toolkit for doing that map project that I mentioned earlier. And there's one about how schools can look into green screens. They're not always a perfect solution for everyone, but they give you some pointers for thinking about it and for sort of reimagining streets outside your school. We've had nearly 100 schools sign up so far. We've been recruiting in London, and about 50 have come from London, but we're getting them across the whole country. And like Nick showed before, it's lovely to see the geographical spread as your programme sort of gains interest on a larger geographical scale. I better finish there because I think I'm probably...
Thank you, Lucy. Yes, bang on time, absolutely perfect.
Okay.
Thanks very much. That again was really useful, really insightful to hear, some of the great examples of where action's been taken and some live, examples for our audience to go off and look at. And there's been some chat about some of the projects that you mentioned. So feel free to drop any links in there to some of the toolkits and things that you mentioned. That would be really, really handy. Thank you, Lucy. Again, just in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on now to our third and final panelist, Dr. Jess Tipton. Welcome, Jess. So we are pleased that you've joined us. You're the head of youth networks at Global Action Plan and founder of the London Schools Eco Network and the UK School Sustainability Network. So you sound like you have a very busy working and professional life, no doubt. And we'd be really delighted to hear more about your thoughts on the topic of our panel today. So Jess, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Marlene and Martin for inviting me to join this brilliant summit. I'm really, really enjoying it. And I'm really pleased to join this particular panel because I think obviously community is at the heart of it, and I've heard it keep coming up in the previous sessions. So and really great to hear from Nick and Darren and George and Lucy just before. So I've been sort of amending what I've been going to say constantly, just so that hopefully I'm not sort of repeating, but I'm kind of echoing and trying to bring things together through what I'm doing with these networks. So I'm going to start. I'm going to talk about why I started with bringing school eco committees together and why there does seem to be a need for this. And it was interesting to hear Lucy saying she wondered if there was a network in London. Well, there is, but it's secondary schools mainly, although we have done some primary things. And really, I'm speaking here on behalf of a whole load of students and staff who are, working so hard on all this stuff, basically in their spare time. So I'm a secondary school modern languages teacher, but just to explain, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades. So I actually have a background of 10 years in environmental policy making at DEFRA, and actually finished work on the 25-year environment plan that was mentioned earlier. And I've also done research into Russia and climate change negotiations. But I'm going to confess that I actually gave up on the planet about 6 years ago because of lack of public engagement, numerous budget cuts, lack of resources. About sort of 6 years ago, I left that and went into secondary languages teaching. But then Greta happened, and in my school and loads of others, the students went out protesting with Fridays for Future. The eco coordinator went on maternity leave. I think this is often a theme, and I found myself back working on the environment, but in a school setting. So it was sometime in 2019, I started bringing just a few schools together in London. I also did a stint with Teach the Future, so it was great to hear from B earlier about how they've been getting on. And as Darren said, I'm now working with the charity Global Action Plan, who've been mentioned quite a lot today, so that I can develop these networks, because it takes a lot of time and energy. So I'm going to just give a few insights into why we needed these networks and what they do. So the initial aim, and I was quite interested to hear George talking about we can't end up just stuck on the sort of planet green agenda. The initial aim was actually in originally just West London, and a shout out here to the next host school, Hammersmith Academy, Sustainable School of the Year, who played a critical role in the early days of the London Schools Eco Network. So we were actually wanting to bring students together from different backgrounds who were living near one another, because London's so cheap by jowl, through something that was meaningful and of mutual interest. And as we know, environmental concern can be a leveller. So there were huge benefits for the students' personal development, their mental health, like we've been hearing from Caroline Hickman, just simply from discussing and then working together on sustainability and climate action with those that they wouldn't otherwise have come into contact with. And we did find that the students would immediately talk to each other, whereas often students from different schools, if it's a history conference or something, they just sort of stay in their zones and they won't talk. But yeah, there does seem to be a galvanizing effect. So it's really, from the outset, been about nurturing a sense of community between schools in tackling these just massive issues, not just on the sort of practical level, but on the psychological level. So London Schools Eco Network, where it started, so we mainly have students from years 10 to 13, so from secondaries of different types, now going across London. And there's really no type of student in our networks. They aren't all outspoken protesters, as Sharon Johnson was talking about earlier, but they are still all activists in their own way, even if they might not call themselves that. And they've got a shared interest in both people and planet. And so they're bringing all these different skills and personalities and experiences into this network. They chair and minute their own fortnightly meetings, so currently obviously all on Zoom, which has helped to bring more students on board. But we're hoping to go back to face-to-face meetings and a sort of hybrid system in the future. They choose their own priorities and campaigns. So some of the past projects are an MP Green Economic Recovery campaign that they got quite a lot of responses from across London. They've been supporting local cycle lanes, done joint newsletters, school assemblies. They fronted the November Youth Climate Summit that Global Action Plan ran. They've led careers conversations with sustainability professionals. They've done primary school workshops, and they run their own social media accounts. So they're learning so much stuff just from an hour a fortnight, and then coming together occasionally for specific projects. So teamwork, communications, leadership, event, project management, And I think that will really help them for their careers. So they're getting involved, they're talking, they're sharing resources, they are taking action. So doing lots of monitoring at the moment. It seems that they do feel they have agency. Way back the beginning of today, when Andreas from OECD was talking, he said this is the thing that is so important and perhaps is lacking, the agency thing. And then in the background of the meetings, we've got school staff. We're such a support for each other, and we have lots of safeguarding in place. So there's a distinction with the incredible youth groups like Fridays for Future or UK SEN, because these are youth-led, but they are school-based. So they're making a difference in their own school, in each other's schools, wider community, supported by teachers and other school staff. So we now have, this has provided a model for networks across the UK. I can, if I stop my video, hopefully you can see, there's also Surrey and Buckinghamshire and Ireland. And I'm talking to people all the time about, grassroots level coming together to form similar networks. And we've now got a UK level network as well, UK School Sustainability Network, for even broader collaboration and sharing. So the thing that struck me is the demand, like we've heard today, to come together. And these students and staff are really getting to know each other over quite a prolonged period, which I think is quite important. Got different backgrounds. We have teachers and support staff of all disciplines and stages in career, which is super interesting. We've got some students and staff, like we've heard, who are lone wolves and really need to find other people. And then we've got some who are representing like a very dynamic eco committee, but they're coming together. So no one, they're in a sort of equal space and sharing ideas and concerns and feeling empowered to go back and influence their own school. So they're not alone, which is really important for what Caroline Hickman was talking about. And they have more impact, like Lucy was saying, from being stronger together, and MPs and head teachers respond more when they approach them together. But I do think, that the reason why they want to come together is not probably that great. It's because they don't have enough agency, perhaps, in their own school, because it is mostly individual staff, with exceptions where you might have a whole school approach. But doing this in their evenings, in their spare time, they might have a nominal role or title or allocation, but this is a massive job, and it doesn't do it justice. Then there's things going on with eco schools, Let's Go Zero, all the other stuff. But I really keep talking about like the staff time and energy and burnout issue. We've all been saying the same thing. The students need to be properly prepared for their careers, their lives. They need the emotional resilience, knowledge and skills. So we really need a systemic approach, but the networks were sort of trying to plug a bit of a gap. So really excited to hear what Department for Education are planning, and I just hope it's adequately resourced and with wide reach. So nearly up for time, so just a shout out to all the staff and students in the networks for all their phenomenal work, and I'm really grateful to Global Action Plan for taking us into their family so we can better support everyone and develop this network of networks across the UK and beyond. And I'll put a few links in the chat. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jess. Really enjoyed your input again as our last panelist. Because of the time constraints then, we've only got 12 minutes left. I'm going to move us on then to the question and answer session. So unfortunately, George has had to leave us, but we've still got 3 of our great panelists with us. Do use the chat function if you'd like to pose any specific questions to our panelists. I know we've had quite a lot of activity in there already, some great comments and sharing of links and useful URLs, etc. So thanks for that. Keep that coming. In the meantime, there was just one sort of point I wanted to raise, which was around, when we're talking about schools as a collective, I think, when we dig down into that term, we're talking about, you know, schools in the wider sense, and schools in terms of the different types of schools that are out there. So we know that we've got some great attendance from a different sort of, you know, different range of schools here today. I think it's important to say that the summit has been here purposely set up to engage all types of schools, whether maintained, academies, private, faith, PRU, special ed. We heard from JCOS earlier on as a lighthouse school for the faith schools community. And so, you know, just to send that message that in line with the whole levelling up agenda and leaving no one behind, really we're talking about schools in the widest sense. And so sometimes I think it would be useful if any schools from you know, those who may not be considered part of the mainstream, to also think about some of the questions for our panel that would apply to them. First of all, though, in terms of questions for our panel, again, I'm going to take my chair's privilege, but I'm actually going to come back to some of Nick's really useful questions in his presentation earlier on, if that's all right, Nick. I'm going to nick Nick's questions. One of the questions that I think would be useful to get our panel's input on would be around, you know, the kind of role that we feel the school, in the widest sort of sense of the meaning, what role could the school play in educating the wider community on important topics? So are there any sort of quick win or feasible sort of things that you think schools could be doing? Who would like to kick us off?
I'm happy to extend the question a bit, and I'll hand straight over to Lucy in just a sec. But because I posed the question initially, I don't necessarily have all the answers. Just to say, I probably would slightly reframe that question, having heard George, and I thoroughly agree. You know, it's not all about educating about climate change. It's kind of a wider conversation on what's important to people at that point in time in you know, the wider people in the community around the school. So I think, you know, just bearing that one in mind, I thought it was a really good point from George, and he'd probably say it again if he was here. Sorry, Lucy, I interrupted you.
That's all right. I was just going to say, I think it's always quite good to just sort of lead by example. So if you're an organisation like a school or a hospital, I've worked with hospitals as well. If you're going to be, I think, you know, you are the centre of your community for many families in the area. I think if you take action and then you let everyone know what you're doing and why you're doing it and what impact it's having, then hopefully it can inspire other people. So, you know, if a school can measure its carbon footprint and then say, you know, we've looked at it, these are our biggest impacts, we're going to try and switch to more, you know, greener energy, you know, just a few sort of simple things that perhaps can be replicated elsewhere. And then the other thing is obviously the children have such a powerful voice, and the education side of it, hopefully they're learning and then they're going home, and those good behaviours are getting then adopted by their parents. You hear children out and about, you know, telling their parents off for getting a plastic bag, or you know, they are starting to sort of look critically at the way that their parents behave, which is great.
If I could jump in perhaps, I was going to say that I think, like Lucy was saying, I think, you know, there's quite a lot of student-led discussions and things like that, and with, you know, bearing in mind safeguarding, sort of opening those up to at least parents, if not other counsellors and other people in the community, and that sort of reverse learning thing, so that you've got different generations talking, and I think getting parents and members of the school community who aren't teachers involved in the whole sustainability thing. So like having a Dragon's Den panel where you have people sort of responding to the students' ideas, and just getting that going with all different people in that school community, not just the academic teachers. And then, I mean, there's stuff like, you know, all the TerraCycle collections, and that gets people into the school and then can sort of see what else is going on. I mean, this is pre-COVID, I know, and secondhand clothing sales. Hammersmith Academy grows stuff for the neighbouring food bank and looks after their care homes gardens, but I don't want to steal their thunder later. Yeah, so they're just a few things off the top of my head.
Fantastic, thank you, Jess. And some of the points that you all referred to, I think, came through in some of what we heard earlier on around, moving from awareness raising through to creating agency and helping and supporting young people to move through to that sort of taking action phase. We've got a question in the Q&A, so just to ask the panelists, this comes from William Finnegan, thanks for your question. Curious about the panelists' thoughts about how schools can play a role in terms of climate adaptation and resilience of the surrounding community. As a scenario for us to think about, what role, for example, would a school need to play in 2050, if we can look that far ahead and even think about that far ahead?
I can jump in with slightly flippant, because I mentioned Bill Finnegan's work with our students. So on letters from the future, that the students with him did like letters to themselves and then made them into videos. So I'd say we need to ask the students or look at those letters.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to give some thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I work sort of more at the, with the individual school level or sort of community level, but I'm imagining with the sort of, net zero plans and local authorities making commitments that they will have to look at their school building stock and try and make sure that they're sort of enabling schools to make changes to lower their footprint. So just as, in school we've had the GLA doing the school air quality audits, I imagine we're going to need sort of similar work with schools to sort of drastically reduce. We've got a lot of very old, very leaky Victorian school buildings in London. So it's quite a big job to retrofit all of those. And that's something that, pupils can get involved in, but it's going to need large amounts of funding from somewhere.
Indeed, indeed.
I know that it's not an issue for many London schools because of lack of space, but where schools do have school grounds or availability of outdoor space, I think thinking particularly about planting schemes and greening the school plate, greening over some of the concrete, etc., making it a bit more accessible, because imagine the concrete, I don't know a lot about this, but will be reflecting a lot of that heat, and as climate is heating up, particularly in the summer months, we're getting more extreme, that kind of awareness of what we're subjecting school pupils to if they're being made to be outside is very important, and perhaps the school can play a role in trialing and sampling different types of planting and different types of shade that could then be very visible very visible to replicate in other public spaces. Perhaps it's about opening up the school grounds. And the other thing I was just thinking of is the sort of social aspect of resilience and in climate adaptation. And so I know a lot of the big problems with heating in particular, which is a very big London issue in the summer months, can be about which parts of the community are less visible, are less visible to the general population. So some older people who never leave their flats, for example. How can the school encourage a sort of rota or mechanism of making sure we're checking on those older people? Are they okay, etc.? And it comes back probably to the role of the school in delivering that wider education role, not just to the students, but also to the wider community. What can people do? For example, I think there was a great example in Islington, which was given about keeping or putting your bed sheets in the freezer just for an hour or so before bed in the very, very hot summer nights or something like that. I'm just talking about climate heating. Obviously, then there's a whole range of things we need to consider about flooding and making school grounds less or more porous and less concrete again.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. If there's no other thoughts on that question, Jess, do you want to come in? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, Nick made me think of something, which is the whole like students doing volunteering and sort of service stuff, and that can be really, really helpful projects, and they're learning at the same time, which might be with elderly people or food banks, or like City Harvest, going to volunteer there and getting work experience at the same time.
Thank you. I'm going to really put our panel on the spot now, because we've only got a minute left. So having listened to everything that's been said during this great sort of hour and 15 minutes that we spent together, if you were to summarize one takeaway message, each of you, for our audience to take away in terms of either what we've discussed or what we've discussed that might provoke, you know, other thinking, what would that one nugget be that you'd like our audience to take away from today's session? So who would like to go first?
I can. Schools can play a very important role in spreading a wider message about climate change to the wider community, and therefore should explore their role beyond the education role.
Brilliant. Lucy or Jess? Putting you really on the spot here, I'm sorry.
I guess my sort of message, I think, responding to Rachel's point about the lone wolves, is you might be in your own school, you might feel you are, but maybe not, but is to find someone else in another school, whether you're a staff or a student. There
will always be someone out there, won't there? And Lucy, one key takeaway.
Yeah, so similar sort of, you know, join up with your local schools in your local area. You'll just have so much more of a powerful voice, and hopefully you can help if you've got a very inspired, engaged community within your school, you know, help inspire the other ones in your local area, perhaps the ones that don't have that, bring them along with you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. We're on the hour, we're just over, so thanks so much to all of our panelists, George, Nick, Lucy and Jess. It's been a real pleasure to chair this and be part of a really exciting event. Big thank you again to Melini, to Martin, to all the organisers. Thank you so much. I hope you've all enjoyed our session. I hope you'll follow up with some of the links and pointers in the chat. And really, just finally from me, a big thank you, and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thanks very much.